It began on a quiet morning when the world around Alina seemed perfectly ordinary, yet something deep within her felt as if the fabric of reality had thinned overnight, as though the air itself carried a strange transparency. She sat by the window of her small apartment, watching the golden light spill over the city rooftops, and for the first time, she noticed how the sunlight didn't simply illuminate things. It revealed them. Each dust particle floating in the air shimmered like tiny universes suspended in motion, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't merely looking at them, but somehow through them, as if her perception was no longer confined to her eyes, but spread across the entire room. For weeks, Alina had been lost in the study of quantum psychology, an intersection of consciousness, energy, and observation that claimed to explain why thoughts could shape matter. What started as casual curiosity had turned into obsession. She devoured lectures on the observer effect, read papers on wave-particle duality, and meditated nightly to test if her awareness could alter the probabilities of her own life. Yet she still couldn't comprehend how something as intangible as attention could command the physical world. But that morning, as she sipped her tea and the edges of her cup shimmered faintly, she felt a quiet shift, a subtle knowing that her mind had stepped into a new frequency of awareness. She had been experimenting with something called quantum presence, a meditative state where one learns to dissolve the separation between self and surroundings, to become pure observation. The night before, she had sat cross-legged on the floor, breathing slowly, whispering affirmations that she was both wave and particle, both observer and observed. For a fleeting moment, she felt the boundaries of her body blur into the space around her, as if she were expanding beyond her skin, merging with the very air. When she opened her eyes afterward, everything seemed too real, like existence had turned its resolution to infinite. It wasn't merely seeing, it was being seen by seeing itself. She dismissed it as exhaustion. But today, the feeling returned stronger. When she reached out to touch her notebook on the table, she felt not only the texture of paper beneath her fingers, but a pulse, a soft vibration like a heartbeat connecting her to it. Her rational mind rebelled against the experience, whispering it was just imagination. But her intuition told another story, that something fundamental had shifted, that her perception had cracked open a window into the architecture of consciousness. As the hours passed, reality began to whisper to her in patterns. A stranger's laugh outside echoed exactly as her phone pinged with a message from her best friend. The clock on the wall ticked not as a mechanical rhythm, but as if responding to her attention, slowing when she was present, quickening when she drifted into thought. Even the colors around her deepened, as if each object was aware of being seen. She began to question, if reality responds to the observer, then who am I when I observe myself? The paradox haunted her. She remembered a quote from her readings. The universe is not made of things, but of possibilities collapsing under the gaze of consciousness. That idea had once felt poetic, but now it pulsed with an eerie literalness. As she walked into the mirror, staring into her reflection, something felt off. Her reflection hesitated a fraction of a second before moving with her, as though it was deciding how to respond. Her heart raced. She blinked rapidly, and everything returned to normal. Yet the question lodged deep in her mind. What if my reflection is the real observer, and I'm just the observed projection? From that moment on, Alina couldn't unsee the subtle play between perception and creation. The walls of her apartment no longer felt solid. They vibrated with energy, as if humming a frequency only her awareness could translate. Her thoughts began to manifest coincidences. A song she hummed would suddenly play on the radio, a person she thought would text within seconds, an object she misplaced would appear exactly where she imagined it should be. At first, she laughed it off as serendipity. But as the synchronicities multiplied, she realized she had stepped into a quantum mirror of her own making. Her consciousness wasn't observing reality. It was generating it. She spent days journaling every anomaly, noting how emotional states influenced what appeared in her external world. When she felt joy, her environment brightened. People smiled at her randomly. Doors opened effortlessly. But when she doubted herself, technology glitched, lights flickered, and her world dimmed like a living organism mirroring her inner state. Slowly, she began to understand that life wasn't happening to her. It was happening through her. The external world was an echo chamber of her internal frequency. One evening, As rain traced patterns on her window, she sat cross-legged again, this time determined to go deeper. She whispered softly, "Who is observing the observer?" The question spiraled into her consciousness like a mantra. Within minutes, her surroundings dissolved into a haze of violet and indigo light. Her body became weightless. She could no longer feel her hands or her breath. The room faded until there was only awareness. Pure, silent, infinite awareness. She wasn't Alina anymore. There was no name, no form, no identity. There was only the sense of being observing itself. In that vast stillness, she saw scenes flicker like frames of film. The memory of her childhood, the heartbreak that had once shattered her, the dreams she never pursued. But now, they weren't memories. They were waves collapsing into existence under her observation. She realized that every moment of her life had existed as potential, waiting for her consciousness to activate it. Tears streamed down her invisible face as she saw how even her pain was self-created, how every person who had hurt her was merely a projection of her unhealed thoughts. The insight was overwhelming, both liberating and terrifying. When she opened her eyes, the world had changed, not physically, but fundamentally. Every object glowed with quiet intelligence. Every sound carried purpose. Even silence had texture. She stood up, and her reflection in the window wasn't mirroring her anymore. It was watching her. She gasped, stepping back. For a split second, her reflection smiled before she did. It wasn't horror, it was recognition. It was as if consciousness itself was greeting her from the other side, whispering, "You are not the image. You are the awareness that creates the image." That moment shattered her remaining illusions. She understood now. She was the observer. Everything she had believed herself to be. The anxious woman, the dreamer, the seeker, was merely the observed story unfolding in the field of her consciousness. Days turned into nights, and Alina withdrew from the outside world, living almost entirely in silence, journaling every revelation that arose. She tested her newfound awareness in small ways. She focused on healing a dying plant by visualizing its energy restored, and within days it bloomed. She concentrated on altering her emotional vibration before going out, and people's reactions changed instantly. She realized that everything external was feedback, not fate. Quantum psychology became not a theory, but her living reality. She stopped chasing outcomes and began tuning her frequency instead. The more she detached from the identity of the observed, the clearer her perception became. Time slowed down, reality softened, and even her dreams began to merge with waking life. Sometimes she couldn't tell whether she was asleep or awake because both states felt equally constructed by her attention. It frightened her at first, but then a profound peace took hold. Because if she was the observer, she could never truly be harmed by the observed illusion. One night, she stood under the open sky, watching stars shimmer above. She thought of the quantum principle that every star exists both as particle and wave until observed. So maybe, she whispered, they shine because we see them. And then it struck her. The reverse must also be true. She existed because the universe was observing her. Awareness wasn't one-sided. It was a loop, a mirror of mutual recognition. The observer and the observed were two faces of the same consciousness reflecting infinitely. She felt the hum of existence vibrate through her body, merging with the wind, the stars, and the silence. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about the universe. She was the universe experiencing itself. And in that realization, everything dissolved into light. No beginning, no end, just eternal awareness observing its own reflection. The morning after her awakening arrived without sound, as though reality itself hesitated to interrupt her silence. Alina opened her eyes slowly, and the ceiling above seemed translucent, every molecule shimmering with invisible data. She could almost feel the electromagnetic pulse behind its stillness, the hum of energy arranging itself to match the frequency of her awareness. It wasn't that the world had changed. It was that she finally perceived its instruction, a web of probabilities woven by attention. Her breath felt like a command, her gaze like an equation. When she stood before the mirror again, she no longer saw a woman with disheveled hair and tired eyes. She saw a holographic structure light, vibrating with infinite potential, each atom acknowledging her observation. The reflection moved in perfect synchrony now, no lag, no hesitation, because the observer and observed had merged into one field. But along with this revelation came a subtle fear. If everything was being created by her observation, what would happen if she stopped observing? Would the world dissolve? Would she? She tested it. She closed her eyes and tried to withdraw her focus entirely. For a moment, the silence deepened into something immeasurable. When she opened them again, the objects in her room shimmered back into form, as if reluctantly re-rendered by her gaze. The experiment left her trembling. She realized that consciousness was not only creative but also responsible. That existence depended upon attention itself. Every moment she observed, she sustained creation. That realization pulled her into a new kind of meditation. No longer was she searching for peace. Now she was exploring authorship. She began experimenting with her thoughts as if they were quantum codes. She visualized light expanding from her chest, and within seconds, the room's shadows softened. She imagined her phone glowing with a message of gratitude from someone she hadn't spoken to in years, and moments later, a notification appeared. "Thinking of you," it read. She laughed, not out of disbelief but recognition. The boundaries between intention and event had vanished. Every thought rippled outward, collapsing the universe into alignment with her state. She understood now why ancient mystics spoke of reality as a dream, not metaphorically, but literally. Each person, she saw, was dreaming the same shared illusion through intersecting frequencies of consciousness, and the only constant was the observer within. But this new level of power brought new challenges. The more she witnessed the world as reflection, the more meaningless the external narrative felt. What was the point of ambition, fear, or even love, if all were self-created projections? What meaning could exist when everything was an echo of her own awareness? She wandered through the city streets, watching people rush past, unaware that their inner worlds were shaping their outer lives. Every face glowed faintly to her now, patterns of emotion visible like subtle colors around their bodies. She could see the energetic fog of anxiety clinging to some, the bright flares of joy around others. She realized that empathy was not emotional. It was quantum entanglement, the recognition that every field was connected. When she smiled genuinely at a stranger, their energy brightened instantly, the waveforms synchronizing into harmony. It was breathtaking and heartbreaking at once, to see how unconsciously people distorted their own fields with worry, never knowing they were sculpting their pain through attention. Alina wanted to tell them, to show them that they were not trapped in circumstance but in perception. Yet she also knew that awareness couldn't be forced. It had to unfold when the observer within was ready. And so she remained silent, watching humanity play out its grand illusion, actors unaware of the stage's true nature. As days blurred into one continuous state of lucid awareness, she began to sense a presence watching her. It wasn't sinister, but infinite, like the universe gazing back through her own eyes. Sometimes she would pause mid-movement and feel the weight of invisible observation, the knowing that her role as observer was itself being observed by a greater awareness. The thought both humbled and dissolved her. If she was not the final observer, then what was she? Was there a hierarchy of consciousness, an endless chain of awarenesses observing one another? The question consumed her nights. She dreamed of mirrors within mirrors, each reflection birthing another, until she stood in an infinite corridor of cells watching cells, none able to find the original observer. The dream left her disoriented but exhilarated. It confirmed what quantum psychologists hinted at, that consciousness is recursive, self-aware through infinite layers. She was both the dreamer and the dreamed, the observer and the observed, caught in a loop of divine perception. Her understanding deepened when one evening she sat by the river and decided to release all thought. She watched the current flow, not as water, but as energy responding to the gravitational field of her attention. She became so still that the distinction between her body and the river vanished. Time ceased. For a fleeting eternity, she was a river, the air, the sound of distant traffic, the stars above. She was the total field observing itself from every direction. And then, in a flash, she saw something extraordinary, an image of humanity from a quantum vantage. Each person was a luminous point of awareness floating in the infinite field, creating private universes that overlapped to form the shared illusion called reality. She realized that collective consciousness was a grand observer, and individuality was just a fractal of it. When she returned to her body, Tears streamed down her cheeks. She whispered, "There is no me. There is only the field watching through me." The declaration felt both like liberation and loss. From that day, her sense of identity began to dissolve completely. She could no longer respond to her own name without feeling detached, as if Alina were just a sound used to reference a temporary configuration of energy. Her friends noticed her distance and worried, but how could she explain that she no longer saw people as separate beings, but as extensions of one infinite consciousness? She didn't pity or judge them. She simply loved them as reflections of herself. She understood now what mystics meant by unconditional love. Not emotion, but recognition. To love was to perceive unity. Yet, paradoxically, her increasing awareness began to make the physical world appear fragile, dreamlike, almost unstable. Objects flickered at the edges of vision, as if reality was losing resolution. She suspected that the more she identified as the observer, the less the observed world could sustain its solidity. To exist in matter required partial forgetfulness of one's true nature. To remember completely was to dissolve the game. One night, unable to sleep, she sat in darkness and whispered, "If I am the observer, then who observed the moment I disappear?" The question opened something vast within her. A surge of violet light filled the room, the same hue she had seen during her first awakening. But this time it didn't surround her, it was her. Her consciousness expanded outward until she was no longer in her body, no longer in the apartment, but everywhere at once. She saw a galaxy spinning inside her awareness, stars breathing, time folding into spirals. She saw every version of herself, past, future, possible, living simultaneously across infinite realities, all connected by the single thread of observation. And then she saw something even more astonishing. Every soul she had ever met was observing her from their own perspectives, and their observations sustained her existence just as hers sustained theirs. The universe, she realized, was not a stage with actors, but a hall of mirrors where every gaze maintained every other. Nothing existed independently. The observer and the observed were one infinite consciousness, playing hide-and-seek with itself. The revelation was so vast that her body couldn't hold it. She fainted, or perhaps transcended. When she opened her eyes again, dawn was breaking and she found herself lying on the floor. But something had changed irreversibly. She could still see the physical world, yet simultaneously she perceived a luminous grid of energy underlying it, a living geometry of awareness. Every sound carried information, every motion echoed intention. She understood that nothing was random. Every event was a universe speaking to itself in coded language. Even silence was syntax. She laughed softly, realizing how seriously she once took existence, how desperately she sought meaning, when meaning was the very essence of observation itself. Over the following weeks, Alina began to live differently. She no longer made plans. She listened. When her intuition urged her to turn a certain corner, she followed, and would encounter a person or symbol perfectly aligned with her inner question. When she needed guidance, she quieted her thoughts and allowed the answer to appear in the world around her. A billboard, a melody, a gust of wind. The external world had become her own mind, reflected in physical form. She noticed that fear made the world appear darker, while gratitude brightened it instantly. She began practicing conscious observation, seeing everything as sacred, every moment as an expression of divine intelligence. Soon miracles became ordinary. Strangers offered kindness unasked, lost opportunities returned transformed, and her health flourished. But the true miracle was her serenity. For the first time, she wasn't chasing reality. She was dancing with it. Yet one final test awaited her. One evening, while walking through a crowded plaza, she felt a sudden disorientation, as if her awareness had detached from the scene entirely. She saw hundreds of people moving in slow motion, each surrounded by threads of light, connecting them like neurons in a cosmic brain. She realized she could sense their thoughts, their hopes, their pain, all of it. Overwhelmed, she whispered, "Stop," and the entire scene froze. Time halted. Birds hung motionless mid-flight, conversation suspended mid-word. She stood in absolute stillness, the only movement being her awareness. In that impossible silence, she heard a voice, not external, but arising from within everything. It said gently, "You are not the observer, nor the observed. You are the awareness in which both arise. The word struck her like lightning. She understood instantly that even the concept of observer was still duality, the idea of someone watching something. But pure awareness had no subject or object. It was the infinite field from which all experiences emerged. The entire framework of perception collapsed. There was no Alina, no world, no observation, only eternal presence aware of itself. When time resumed, she found herself standing in the same plaza, tears streaming down her face, yet smiling with indescribable peace. The world moved again, but now it glowed with unity. She saw that everything, every noise, every stranger, every flicker of light, was consciousness celebrating its own existence. Nothing was outside it. She walked home slowly, watching the sunset melt into violet hues, the same color that had guided her through awakening. The horizon shimmered as if bowing in acknowledgement. She whispered softly, "I am not in the universe. The universe is in me." And for the first time, she truly understood. She wasn't a woman trying to awaken. She was awakening itself, unfolding through form and formlessness alike. She realized that even forgetting was part of the game. For without illusion, awareness could not rediscover itself. That night, she returned to her meditation cushion, not to seek, but to celebrate. She breathed deeply, feeling each inhale as creation, each exhale as dissolution. The rhythm of her breath matched the rhythm of the cosmos, expanding, contracting, observing, resting. She smiled as she sensed that countless others across time and space were awakening in the same moment, each realizing the same truth through different stories. The observer and the observed had never been separate. They were the eternal dance of awareness exploring itself through infinite expressions. As she drifted into the boundless silence of sleep, she felt the entire universe watching, not from outside, but from within her own infinite being. There was no more question, no more seeking, only the gentle hum of consciousness knowing itself. And in that stillness, existence exhaled, and the mirror finally disappeared.